The Germans have the first play on the first turn. Again, they have their mechanized divisions on the board, but no supporting infantry corps. So I suppose you could wait a turn for your infantry to come in before starting your attack, but that seems like a real waste of time, and the game wouldn't want you to do that. It wouldn't start on this turn if it wanted you to wait for the infantry. So what do we do with these mechanized units? What's their real strength? Is it their combat power, their mobility, or a combination of the two? Taking a closer look at the situation on the north side, this is Hoth's command, and he's going to be driving for the city of Vitebsk here. It's fairly well defended, relatively speaking. There's infantry, tank, even a little bit of an air force there. And also the fixed fortifications. So we don't necessarily want to run our tanks into a attritional battle for the city. We probably want to run them around and try to encircle and cut them off from their supply sources. There's the 20th Panzer Division here on the far north side. He has this, low-level road referred to as a track in the game. He could potentially exploit to move north around the city. But obviously he has Soviet defenders here and here. He has a long way to go to get there. So how does he fight his way in there? They need to make maximum use of their time this turn. OCS has a movement phase, followed by a combat phase, and then followed by an exploitation phase. So how do we get good things happening in all three of those phases? Well, along with many, many games, OCS has a concept of an overrun. That is a combat that occurs during movement. That kind of combat requires good strength, a lot of movement capability, in order to keep it going more than one particular combat. So since we want to make these deep drives, we need to move as far as we can, as fast as we can in conducting combats along the way, hopefully in all three of our phases. Pull back the curtain on our 20th Panzer. See, it's actually composed of a number of units. Motorcycle, tank, some motorized infantry, and artillery. The numbers on the lower right of the counters are the movement potential. They have different values. There's also different colorations. There are three types of movement in the game. There is leg movement, denoted by the white color on the number. So this Pioneer battalion can move 4 movement points. The Soviet division has 2 movement points. This is a motorcycle battalion. They have a mechanized type of movement called tracked, denoted by the yellow and the red number. Obviously, they're much faster than those foot-bound infantry. Same for those armor. There are some infantry here, and they are leg movement, 3 movement points. Notice they have those little wheels underneath the infantry symbol. That indicates a certain amount of motorized capability and movement. But what we're looking at here are the front of the counters. This is called the combat mode, so you have the maximum combat power but less movement. If you flip them to the reverse, they are in move mode. And you notice they have much higher movement rates. And that leg infantry now has a black 16. And the black indicates wheeled motorized movement. So track, wheel, and leg. Again, if I flip over the Soviets there, they would become faster, but still leg movement. So pure infantry usually only has leg movement. Motorized can move leg or truck, and then tracked vehicles just have a higher movement potential in their move mode. And the different categories of movement, track, truck, and leg, also have different movement costs for the terrain they're going to be traversing. As you can guess, leg moves better in the heavier types of terrain like woods and forests. Track and truck have much harder time in those terrain. But there's other effects of those movement as well. Like many games, OCS has a concept of a zone of control. Units projected into their adjacent hexes. But it's a little different. It's sometimes sticky, many times not. So for movement of leg and track units, they can actually move through zones of control, paying terrain costs, of course, but otherwise are unimpeded. So it very much favors mobile warfare. So this leg unit could move, if he had the movement points, completely around and infiltrate behind that enemy unit. Same for tracked units. And the difference is truck wheeled units actually have kind of a sticky ZOC. If they enter into a zone of control, they must either stop or conduct an overrun attack. So the ZOC rules really want to see overrun attacks occurring and want infiltration kind of movement going on. You don't get any free lunch by lining up units every other hex with a locking ZOC. If you want to defend a line heavily, you better man every single hex in that line. Or get behind it and then counterattack and punish anybody who exposes themselves. Combat in OCS is fairly straightforward. It's a typical combination of attack factors against defending factors and any terrain modifiers and such, establishing a ratio, and then rolling dice on a combat results table. But it can still be a little complicated. Looking back at the terrain chart, we can see terrain is grouped into categories. Open, close, very close, extremely close. Obviously, open flat ground is going to be very conducive to combat, and the more tight the terrain is, the less effective on the attack. And that's carried over here to the combat result table. See, you have the different categories of terrain and a bunch of different odds. So you would calculate your odds and find your terrain and find the odds for that, or the closest for that terrain. So just looking at this, a 1-to-1 attack in the open is equivalent to a 4-to-1 attack in extremely close terrain. So obviously that means to get the same effect in extremely close terrain, you have to have a much more powerful attack going on. Also, the type of combat unit will affect some of the modifiers, such as tanks in the open have an advantage against infantry types. But that effect can be diminished if they're facing other tanks or mechanized kind of forces. Artillery, like this 92nd Regiment, and air power conduct barrage attacks, which is a special kind of attack that can inflict losses, but generally its goal is to disorganize and diminish the fighting ability of the target. Those typically happen in a step prior to actual combat with the odds and the dice. But in an overrun, there's actually a special kind of air power called the hip shoot, and it's intended to be a quick strike, sort of a blitzkrieg kind of attack that happens just at the moment prior to the overrun attack being conducted. So it's a little less effective than a full-on airstrike, but it does give you a bit of an advantage just at the moment of moving and attacking that can really make a difference in overrun combats. So with all that, we take a look at our position here. The 20th Panzer is starting out right here. We have to figure how far we think we can get them this turn. What kind of follow-on support we could possibly have. We have the 12th Panzer here. The 7th Panzer there. Those are both in Hoth's corps. So we could potentially make a strike along the north here and potentially get behind the city. But the question is, how far do we think we can get? And how exposed will we be? We have to make sure we don't get ourselves cut off by the Soviets in their turn. We want to keep our guys alive and fit and supplied, ready to fight, even more in the next turn. So the 12th Panzer is pretty far away. He's all the way over here. In combat mode, his infantry isn't going to get very far. Even his armor won't get very far, so it's likely that they will have to switch into movement mode. The question is, do we try to make more than one overrun attack with the 20th Panzer? Can we blast that Soviet infantry division and maybe even get as far as Gorodok there and attack that Soviet headquarters? This is where perfect planning comes into play in OCS. You do your analysis, you count your movement factors, your combat factors, and even talk about our supply points here that we have to expend to do all this stuff, and figure out how far we think we can get, what our best position is to make our attacks this turn as many as we can, and maximize our movement, our combat, and even our exploitation phases, and also prepare ourselves for the possible counter moves by the enemy in their half of the turn. And of course, that's only one section of the battlefield. Here we have the center line, the main road running up towards Smolensk. Look how heavily defended that is. Again, there's a couple of German panzer divisions out in front. So we have to plan, analyze, figure out what we can do with them, use them to the best advantage. And then, of course, the southern half. More mechanized divisions, another city, well defended, a river line. These are some tough nuts to crack here. I find the history is often a good guide, but then I find myself thinking, God, how do they do that? I don't think I can do that in a game. So while I'll try to use the historical paths, I'm not sure I can pull them off quite as effectively. And this is where practice really helps. Set up the opening moves. Give them a try. See what you get out of it. Make some adjustments. But anytime you have an opening move of any attack, at any point during a game, you can have numerous. It really pays off to plan in advance what you think you can do, based on some experience, of course, but also just analyzing the tools you have at hand and what you're facing. I mean, for instance, down here along the river line, there's a lot of swampy ground there. That's not good for tanks. That's a very good defensive position, but you have some open ground here. So this might be the way you get around and make your breakthrough. Now for the Soviets, they're not going to be able to do much on this opening turn anyway, given the special turn 1 effects that recognize the disorganization of the Soviet forces in general, and it limits their movement abilities. So their best bet may be just to maximize terrain, take advantage of any blocking positions, and make very conservative counterattacks as they present themselves. It's hard to form a plan in this kind of a position when you have so little to work with in terms of countering what you know is coming. But if they can hold this part of the line and limit the break, they might be able to do well here in the south. In the center, they're helped by some terrain here as well. But always remember, we're trying to protect our trace supply lines, these railroad lines, as much as we can. Keep ourselves alive. Even if we get pocketed, there are ways for us to survive, but the longer we can stay in trace supply, the the more we can slow down the Germans. And this north side is really the most open ground we're looking at. Not a lot of help from the terrain here. The river will help, but they do have these roadways that are kind of lightly defended by these weak infantry divisions. So trying to bolster our defenses around the terrain is likely going to be our best bet in terms of countering any envelopment attacks. Big picture, this is the completion of 2 turns, or 1 week. Sure doesn't seem like enough has happened for the Axis. The general plan was to try a big double envelopment south around Mogilev and north around Vitebsk, hopefully meeting in the middle here and cutting off the 3 cities and pocketing some forces and making their way forward. Their biggest challenge is this really strong defense along the river lines. They don't have any good crossing points except at the cities. The cities are well defended, so they're trying to skirt the cities and make some ad hoc crossing points with their bridge capabilities. And those are good enough for a short term, but they'll be extremely difficult to make use of in the long term. Going for a closer look on the north side. The Axis have looped around here, established their bridge there, and made a crossing. The objective was to try to pinch off Vitebsk, especially with the arrival of the infantry corps on the second turn. And they almost got it done, but they couldn't quite pinch off that road. See, the Soviets were able to create a little land bridge there to keep these forces in supply. Now the bridge, it's not really a great piece of engineering. This is a major river, which is a very serious impediment to movement. The bridge makes it seem like a minor river, so it's still an impediment to movement. In that regard, it's going to be really hard to keep these folks in supply, both trace and combat, to continue the attack. So there's a great number of transportation assets gathering here, and the goal is to get them into this area so we can establish a trace supply point back to the map edge, because the Axis are still really limited by supply points on the map edges. So the further they go away from them, the harder it is for them. But if they can get an extender right to here, get them back to these supply points, then they can trace and combat supply more easily across the river here. In the center around Orsha, see, the Axis really haven't tried to pressure them at all. Again, the infantry is coming up, and they'll be able to put pressure here, but the mechanized forces really weren't trying to attack that very strong position. The Soviets managed to get a headquarters here. That'll help them in the long term. In the short term, it allowed them to push supply up that road to keep Vitebsk in supply as well. So the Soviets are doing pretty well here in the center, but then they weren't being really pressed at all in that area. And in the south, around Mogilev, this was the double-pronged attack that the Axis were trying to pull off. There is a road in a town right here, across this major river, that they hope to crack, get a pincher envelopment, along with another one of these bridges across, this major river, and cut them off. And they got close. They were able to push some infantry across here, but they could not capture that city, which is a big hindrance. But they did manage to otherwise pocket these forces here. The big thing they were able to do was to prevent any movement of a Soviet headquarters into this pocket. Headquarters are going to be pretty vital for keeping pockets alive, using the supply cache technique, hack, whatever you want to call it, to get trace supply into there. But as it stands, the Soviets, though pocketed, were able to eat off the map. They were able to push just enough supply into that place to keep that force alive and in trace supply. Probably for another turn, at the very least. Otherwise, the Axis have it cut off, even though they're kind of thinly held. The Soviets weren't able to get a counterattack this far with the movement points they had available to them. But the Axis are facing a very similar problem here in the south. They weren't able to get across the river with a bridge. So they've got one of these, engineering constructed bridges. And that's fine, except that it's really hard to get supply across that bridge. So again, they have some transportation assets. The goal is to get them up to here, make an extender back to the supply points way on the west edge, and then be able to supply forces with that headquarters across the river. Now the basic Soviet plan is to contest what they can contest, but always have an idea of their next line of defense. Here in the south they have some pretty excellent terrain here in the form of this river. Once the Axis have used those two bridge markers, well, they're not going to be able to have them available for the next river line. So those will be good points to defend, possibly stymie the Axis here. And really in the north they're doing okay as well, because they have some really heavy terrain, forest, swamp, poor roadway, no railways up here. So the Axis are going to be kind of confined in their avenues of advance. So that gives us good positions for our defense. We will have 3 new armies arriving right in this area, and they'll be able to move up and hopefully man these positions, as well as our better supply and replacement rates, which should allow us to recycle divisions from the front and get them back here. I think Orsha is probably going to hold out for quite a while. It has a headquarters, it has a big stockpile of supply, it has the double-tracked rail that can probably stay open for another couple of turns, and that should be able to make a really big pocket, and probably a very durable one. The Axis have to get their logistic plan into position. They have to be able to get supply across these points. They're really, really hoping to have a better point here. If they can't shut down this area, then they're never going to be able to take out Orsha. And they need to move their supply lines forward. They will get railroad conversion units, and they really have 2 places where they can do that. Here, along that line, and really there. Those are the 2 best. But if this is going to be blocked for a long time, going to have to abandon that idea and move to this rail line down here through Mogilev. So that would give 2 converging pinchers around and supporting these pockets. But it's all moot if they can't get these attacks moving effectively with supply and with forces. All in all, I'd say the Axis actually did kind of poorly. They didn't really threaten the Soviet front line as much as they needed to. They inflicted casualties, to be sure, but they expended too much of their own supply getting that done. I think the next turn will be really critical to pocketing, really sealing off and pocketing some of these forces.